All right, hello. I'm Alex Schultz. I'm a journalist at Hard Reset, which is a newsletter about tech, labor, and power. And joining me today for an interview is Aron D'Souza. Aron is a lawyer and businessman. I am reading off your own website here. You are the founder and CEO of Primary, the AI native news and intelligence company building the Primary Index, the world's first AI-powered index of journalism. Aron also founded Enhanced Games, which just happened in Vegas a couple months ago, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
You led or a big part of the lawsuit against Gawker Media involving wrestler Hulk Hogan. And you also previously launched Objection a few months ago.
Yeah,
Did I get that all right so far?
that's all correct. That is who I am, and very proud of my track record.
Cool. Well, I'd reached out to you a couple months ago about Objection because I had some questions about it, and I wrote a very critical essay about it. I'm not sure if you caught that or not. I'm sure I'm not. You've caught a few of those along the way, and so I do want to say up front that I appreciate you chatting with me because
Hey, what I always say is I appreciate criticism, right? Because it allows us to get feedback, evolve the product, and improve. You could go back through my history of Enhanced Games and listen to some of my early interviews where I talked to some journalists who were very critical of what we were doing, and it helped evolve the business model and build in my opinion, a very successful organization.
Well, I wanted to kind of focus this on the sort of the state of journalism, especially your views on the state of journalism, since this
Yeah.
seems to be what you're investing a lot of time and effort into between Objection and now Primary. Um, I guess to start, what is driving your interest in journalism? It's something I'm very curious about.
So my interest in journalism is actually wider. It's about information quality in the 21st century. So um, the problem of information quality manifests itself in a lot of ways. In journalism, it's called fake news, and in AI, it's called slop. And ultimately, public trust in journalists have declined substantially over the last 50 years. So if you read the Gallup poll, it's gone from about 70% down to 28%. And among Republicans, it's only 8% now. Trust in AI systems has declined rapidly also. And so I think the biggest opportunity and the essential challenge of the 21st century is how do we know what information to trust and what are trustworthy sources? And just because someone works at the New York Times or just because the Claude bot says something doesn't mean it's necessarily true. And we as humans need better systems for assessing information quality.
I think on that point, we completely agree. I question whether we have the same solutions, but I guess that's what we're going to get into here a little bit more.
Well, let me ask you a question, Alex, because I'm
Sure.
a venture capitalist and an investor,
Yeah.
right? If I gave you $100 million, how would you improve journalism?
Uh, I have long believed that journalism is not a field that benefits from necessarily from a bunch of private capital and venture capital. I think in a world that doesn't exist and probably never will, journalism is best off being subsidized, publicly funded through grants for specific nonprofit purposes. I think some of the issues you're raising around corporate media in particular, we probably are aligned on. I don't know if the
Yeah.
specific things we object to are the same, but as far as what drives editorial decisions, particularly in corporate media, I think those are real. So if I was given
Yeah,
$100
sure.
million,
Yeah, we could talk about Rupert Murdoch all day long, right?
I would reinvest a
Um,
lot of it into local newsrooms. I would reinvest a lot of it into investigative journalism, accountability journalism, this type of
but
stuff that
how
requires,
yeah, but
yeah.
how would you fund journalism? So you think journalism should be funded by government?
Probably, which I realize, especially for people on the left, is an uncomfortable thing to talk about, given who the current president is. And I don't
Yeah,
pretend that
yeah,
that's
no,
an easy solution.
do you want the problem that we face is that the only um, economic system that works for funding investigative journalism is government funding today, right? So If you look at the operating margins of the BBC, or say, if you look at the operating margins of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they're very narrow, right? And in most cases, negative now. And so, the ability for privately owned news organizations to invest in investigative journalism is de minimis, except for the New York Times. The New York Times actually has decent operating margins, right?
Yes.
But outside of that, like in Europe, right, the only organizations that can do investigative journalism are publicly funded ones. Now, this is the inherent problem in public funding is who's going to investigate the government when the government is the financier of journalists, right? And, you'd say, well, the BBC has strong editorial independence, etc. But at the end of the day, the BBC is dependent on TV license revenue, which is set by the government. And it is fundamentally, like if we distill it down, right, what is the purpose of journalism, right? Yes, it's nice to write sports coverage. It's nice to write lifestyle coverage, but it's actually investigative journalism. That's like the core central function of the news media. And it's not just investigative journalism against corporations and against not-for-profits. It's investigative journalism against government, right? How do we hold government to account? And I don't think you can hold government to account when you're being funded by them.
I think it presents huge issues, but I think those already exist in the current structure. So I guess if we can recenter this a little bit here, what is primary in your own words? What is the purpose of primary?
It's to build a rank order, permanent record of journalists. So journalists love giving out ranking systems. So Bloomberg ranks the billionaires. U.S. News and World Report, the whole business is ranking colleges, universities, hospitals, doctors, lawyers, etc. Yet there has never been a ranking system of journalists. Now, and what is even more important, there is not a permanent record of journalists. So think, there is for Hollywood, there's IMDb, which is actually one of the oldest websites. It's been around since the mid-90s. But there is not one for journalists. So like, I was actually just being interviewed by a seasoned author from The Atlantic. And I asked him, do you have a record of every article you've ever published? And he's like, no. It's like some he can't even access himself now. And I think this is a major structural problem with journalism because we say it is important, journalists have an important duty to guard our democracy. Well, we should be able to judge the permanent record of across one's career and see it as in a similar way to IMDb. And so that's, this is one of the challenges we were trying to solve with the primary.
Your previous venture, Objection, it relied on sort of an AI tribunal. My understanding was it was a mixture of LLMs that you were able to incorporate to, you pulled in a variety of them. How does primary work? I assume it's based on some sort of LLM too, but I was unclear on how that works.
So effectively, why have journalists been giving out rankings and awards yet for decades now? Yet no one has been able to build a ranking system of journalists is because AI is only available now, right? And the ranking of journalists needs to be done on an article by article basis, right? So it's computationally very intensive, and we use 26 billion tokens to get to version 1, which is only across about 2 million articles and 20,000 journalists. So we've only scratched the surface of the analysis. And the way it's done is that we analyze across 7 categories, including polemical language, source balance, distinguishing between fact and opinion. And that's all analyzed by an application layer that is fully disclosed. You can read the methodology on our website.
The investor page for Objection said it was a privately held tech company backed by leading venture capital firms. Just reading that back. Are those firms backing primary?
I'm principally funding primary myself, so.
Okay, so is Peter Thiel involved in this venture like he was the prior venture?
He's been a friend and advisor to all of my projects for 20 years, and we discuss things very frequently, but I'm the principal funder of primary.
Okay. How far along would you say primary is as far as indexing outlets and journalists? I know it's the first week, so I'm sure you're still working through some things.
I would say we're at like 0.1% of this project, because the project is not just about indexing every journalist in the world, right? It's not just about analyzing their full history, but it's also about creating new tools that enable journalists to be better at their jobs.
Okay, because I pulled a couple random profiles, and I admit I was a
Yeah.
little confused by some of the scores, but I want to give you a chance to respond because I assume genuinely this is the first week. There's things you're working through here.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I'd appreciate your feedback on the scores because the scoring is actually really difficult, right? So if you look at things like um, quality of sourcing, right? Um, an author can be very good at showing their sourcing, right? They can say, this study said X, they said Y, but because of the limit of computation, we're not able to actually go all the way down to that source material and verify if the claim made by the author in the article matches the source, right? So that's why those figures might be off.
right.
But it's a long ranging project, and the goal is to you know um, index all journalistic content. But like the week that Google launched, I think they probably had only a few million articles, a few million web pages indexed, and it took them a decade to be fully comprehensive.
For sure. I guess I'm trying to unpack how much of this is early days stuff that you're going to fix up as you go versus a genuine philosophical difference in how you view journalism. So I want to give you an example.
Yeah,
I pulled Maggie Haberman, obviously a very famous
yeah,
journalist.
sure.
One of her most recently indexed articles was about Trump. Trump plans to fire FDA commissioner. It was from May or June, I think. It
Okay,
must
yeah.
have been May. The article has a 496 out of 1,000 rating,
Hmm.
and primarily she seems to have been digged for its sourcing. Sources rating is 182 out of 1,000. And I assume this is an AI summary. Please correct me if I'm wrong. It says
Yeah,
there is one named directly quoted source, President Trump, who was quoted dismissing the firing report. There are two anonymous sources, a person briefed on the matter and a person close to the conversations. So I will say up front, I agree with the concept that when you name a source, that is a much stronger attribution method than anonymous
absolutely.
sourcing. It carries higher weight, it carries more legitimacy. When I work on stories, I always encourage people to go on the record, but there are lots of reasons why you can't. And in this case, the on the record source is Donald Trump, who has an enormous history of changing his mind every 10
Yeah.
seconds and flat out lying about
Well,
things.
well, but that's also the thing. Donald Trump, because of the intense scrutiny placed upon him, more or less has a permanent record in the public consciousness that is well documented, right?
But you
Versus,
wouldn't say he's a source who is very trustworthy, would you? Like it seems that your AI, your LLM has assigned Trump a level of. I mean, to be clear, this story. So Haberman was given a 182 score, and 2 days after the story published, I checked, the FDA commissioner was fired or left or something. So she
right?
was correct.
So she's correct, and that's actually really powerful, and that is you're anticipating like a version 2 feature, which is predicting the future,
Hmm.
right? So if Maggie Haberman says the FDA commission is about to be about to step down, and predicts that, right, with anonymous sources, her rating in a future version would dramatically increase if that was proven to be true later.
Okay,
Yeah.
I
So
guess
like
so.
like that's a very powerful indicator of quality of journalism. Now, the philosophical difference that I think you and I can let's discuss is the use of anonymous sources, right? So um, the use of anonymous sources is a powerful asymmetry because the person who is being attacked by the anonymous source is named, but there is no opportunity to rebut or analyze the credibility of the anonymous source because it sits behind, uh, a claim made by the journalist or the editorial board. Now, what we don't know with anonymous sources used by major media outlets is the level of verification that was undertaken, and I think this is a major structural gap that leads to and is one of the primary reasons why public trust in media has declined so substantially. So in a better world, Maggie Haberman would not have said, a source close to the president says X. She would have said, a source who was independently verified, maybe by the primary, said X, right? And how could that anonymous source verification happen? Well, it's actually a cryptographically complex problem. It's one of the things that my engineering team and myself spend actually most of our time on because, well, do we know that they worked, was it a source close to the president or was it someone who worked at the White House? Could they verify that they have a White House ID, right? Like, Alex, how do you know that I'm Aron D'Souza?
Well, we're speaking to each other right now and your title is on there and I'm taking the reasonable conclusion that this is you. If you're indicating that it's possible that you could be an AI version of yourself and that I should be quadruple checking my work, I would say that's absolutely true. But I also think that there's a part of this that it seems to be missing to me, which is when you are reporting a piece like that, when Maggie is making a reported piece like that, what I will say is there are outlets that do not have the layers of fact checking that they should. And the reasons for that are systemic. There's not enough money in journalism. A lot of these places are decimated, frankly, by a lot of private equity that buys people up.
So one of the core problems about journalism is also it's an intensely competitive field, right? So the New York Times wants to break the story first, and therefore the detail of fact checking and verification cannot keep pace with the commercial incentive to publish quickly. Right, that's an intrinsic.
But that's a big claim about the New York Times. Like
I'm not saying the New York Times, but every media outlet wants to publish first.
For sure. I want to ask you this, and I don't mean this in some gatekeepy journalism way, but I'm genuinely curious. Like, do you know what Maggie had to do to get that story over the finish line on published? Like the layers between calling her source.
None of us actually know. Right. So like the meetings of the editorial board are not a matter of the public record. Right.
But the journalistic process for a place like the Times is, if you work in that field, pretty known. She has to talk to her editor.
Wait. So this is the funny thing, right? So when I'm on the record talking to journalists and we're doing a podcast that is recorded, they always say, yes, absolutely. Our processes are so robust. Right, I've got to go to the editorial board every single time I use an anonymous source. I've got to show all the evidence. But when you're there in a bar, having a beer or two, they become more honest, right? They say, well, 30 years ago it's different, right? We had a lot more resources. The print deadlines were structurally paced out, and now we have to be first to publish, right? We don't want to be beaten by someone on Twitter. Right, like let's be honest with ourselves. Like the resourcing that is available and the structural incentives don't align with the production of high quality, verifiable information. And it is as you said, it's very gatekeepy to suggest that the New York Times, with its opaque processes, controlled by its billionaire owners, somehow should be just trusted for the fact they're a 175-year-old brand, right? And actually, technological processes, should be investigated and implemented that allow us to verify things in a much more transparent way. And this is why public trust in these institutions have declined so much. It's like I didn't make that up, right? We all know this.
A few thoughts on that. One is I certainly don't disagree that public trust in journalism has decreased quite a bit. I do think there's an enormous partisan divide there. It's not entirely, both sides are declining at the same rate here. And I think there are reasons for that have to do with a lot of framing from the current president, both in his first and second term.
But it's also the fact that when you have to look at the financial incentives. So the incentives vary by media outlet, and you can see this in the manifestation in the primary index. So like the Daily Mail is a content factory, right? They produce thousands of articles, right? And the quality is very low because they are optimizing for ad revenue. They have very few subscribers, virtually none actually. The New York Times revenue base is mostly from its subscribers. Ads are uh, of, of, of lower importance. And so, what does the New York Times optimize for? It is satisfying its subscriber base. And it knows its subscriber base is mostly Democrats. And so, they have to write to suit those subscribers. And subscriber satisfaction is very important to them.
I think there's certainly truth to that. I don't know if I understand the idea that that um, if you're tailoring your content towards a subscriber base, then that means that any of the editorial decisions, whether you have to talk to a fact checker, whether you have to pre-clear a source with your editor, those sort of barriers to publishing a story are out the window. And I would argue the Times is, and it's a luxury on their part that a lot of journalists are frankly jealous of. They do have those layers in place. Now, I have seen stories they've published that I do not agree with the bent that they take, the ideology that I can see in the reporters' language that they use. There are stories that I think have been shoddily reported by the Times, but I think in general, they are one of the few that there is actually, you're talking about these structural systems and how to get to a place. And they actually do have those systems. They do have those systems in place.
But we should be far more transparent about those. So our Congress, our parliaments, they sit in public, right? Courts sit in public. Why is this? So that there can be public scrutiny of every decision. So the greater the power of an institution has, the more scrutiny should be placed upon them. And you as a journalist must agree with this, right?
I do, but I think, and I don't want to get too bogged down in this because we only have a few minutes left, and I've seen you discuss this in other interviews, the idea of anonymity and how it is opaque. But I think it is ignoring an obvious power dynamic here, which is why a source might not go on the record with something and why a reporter might have to keep a source under wraps for any number of reasons. If you want to say that there are times when someone is granted anonymity that should not be, sure, totally agree with you. But I do not think that that's a fair standard to apply across the board here, which is, it seems to be what's happening with a lot of this analysis.
No, but so the issue is, in fact, that if a source has been granted anonymity, there should be a comprehensive disclosure of that, and also the steps shown for verification, right? So one thing that I often see in the tech world is a line of something of the ilk, which would be like, a director at Google who wished to remain anonymous said X, right? And so the casual reader who reads this says, wow, a member of the board of directors made that statement, right? But actually, as you well know, there are thousands of people with the title of director. And journalists intentionally use this in a way to obfuscate that they have a more senior source than they in fact do, right? And it's impossible to diligence because they're not disclosing who's given that source. And so I think it would be a much better process if instead of the journalists going to the editorial board and saying, I'm going to use an anonymous source, they go to an independent third party who adjudicates and verifies that that source actually exists, right? And that they have like a, in the case of the White House, like a whitehouse.gov email address, right? And they are not an intern. They are actually like, a senior source, right? And we can't trust our democracy to gate-kept processes owned by billionaires. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I think the owned by billionaires part is a nice way of reframing that on your side, but I'm not sure that this has been the reality for many years. The biggest stories in the last 70, 80 years in journalism were anonymously sourced. The most famous source of all time, Deep Throat, was anonymously sourced. And I'm sure that was something that you would say that was an incredible piece of journalism. So this is not a new phenomenon.
It's not a new phenomenon, but public trust in the institution of journalism is declining so quickly and this is such a major issue for our democracy that, I feel morally obliged. Like, I could be retired now. I've got tons of money. Why am I putting it all into building a new method of journalism? So I think it's really important for our society. And we should think from a blank slate, using all the tools that we have in the era of technology, to how we can really improve this institution. And, there was a print to digital transition over the last 20 years. And you know what? A.G. Sulzberger, Rupert Murdoch, Lord Rothermere, all these guys, they got it wrong, right? They got it really, really wrong. They gave up all their distribution to the technology companies. And journalism is in three phases. It's research, synthesis, and distribution. They've lost distribution. Synthesis, the writing, is being eroded right now by the LLMs, and research is the final frontier of it, right? And I think the journalistic industry, the profession, needs to introspect and say there are great technological tools available now. We have infinite capacity for machine-based reasoning, and these can be used to solve a lot of these structural problems.
I want to turn, because I only have about 5 minutes here, and I want to just run through a few questions here.
Yeah, I've only got 2 minutes, so because I got to stop on the half hour.
Okay. Is Primary a relaunch, or is it a different product than Objection?
It's a relaunch. It's the same team. Objection we will bring back in due course. The thing that we learned from the first Objection launch is that we need engagement from both sides. We need the subjects of the articles who are filing the objections and the journalists to participate. Now, there were some journalists who did participate, but they did so by writing about objection, not participating in this adversarial structured process. And there's no point in giving out a grade unless there's a report card. And the report card is this permanent record, and so the IMDb for journalists that we are creating.
How many people signed up, like paid money, like a fee to do an objection, to file an objection?
There were a few dozen who started the process. But one thing that we learned was that unless we had engagement from the other side, it was not relevant to even take their money.
So were they refunded ultimately?
Yeah.
Okay. Because the way it was framed was there was overwhelming. I mean, you wrote to me, there was customers want to adjudicate much more complex cases with commensurate willingness to pay. That implied to me that there was another thing about overwhelming interest.
Yeah. So the people who wanted to pay, let me be clear, were some of the wealthiest people in the world. They were billionaires, right? And they said, I'd pay $100,000, $200,000 to analyze this case, this article, but unless the journalist from the other side was going to actually participate, it's pointless to take on a brief like that.
Got it. Do you have time for one more question, or do you have to run?
I've got to run, but if you ask, I can give you a quick answer.
You wrote that that journalism is sort of in this crisis moment. It relies on clicks and advertising. And it struck me as a slightly outdated view of journalism, that journalism is now actually based on subscriptions, paid newsletters. SEO is gone because Google decided SEO is gone. Yeah. Part of my skepticism of what you're doing, to be candid with you, is do you understand what journalism really is at this point? You say you want to be one of the structural fixes behind it. How do you explain that disparity to me as we wrap up here? Is it really about clicks and advertising in 2026? I guess I'm curious where you're coming out from with that.
That's a fair criticism. A lot of people said, "Hey, Aaron, your mentality of journalism is stuck in, from a decade ago with, the new media of Gawker, BuzzFeed, and those people, which shaped my experience very deeply." Right? I was talking to a New York Times journalist recently, and he was like, "Oh, the whole nature of the industry has changed, and the bottom feeders that were writing at Gawker don't exist anymore." I'm like, that's a fair point, right? And I'll accept that criticism. But I also think that, having spent a lot of time with media moguls, the press barons, the billionaires that own many of these media outlets, they're not thinking about the transition from digital to agentic. Right? They're not thinking about what are the new tools and the change in consumption patterns that are going to happen. And I think that the way we consume news will be radically different in 5 years from the way we do it today.
Got it. Well, thank you very much for your time, Aaron. I do really appreciate it.
I appreciate your questions, and hopefully when I'm in Brooklyn, we can shoot live in person, because I really do enjoy these chats.
It's good to know. I do appreciate that.
Okay, see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.